myself first. I have a passion for justice, and I want to tell you where it comes from. My dad was a lawyer. He was a solo practitioner in the District of Columbia in the early 1950s. Gets a call from a client. The client has received a subpoena from the Senate Committee on Permanent Investigations. That's the McCarthy Committee. The client is a guy who is a bookbinder in the government printing office. And he says to my dad, I don't know why I've been subpoenaed, but here it is. My dad, he couldn't afford to pay for a lawyer, so my dad agreed to represent him. As soon as he did, he was summoned down to Capitol Hill to meet with the counsel to the Permanent Investigations Committee, a guy named Roy Cohn. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, Roy Cohn was Joe McCarthy's henchman. And he said to my dad, look, your client's a communist. He's in a lot of trouble. You represent him, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. My advice to you is get rid of him as fast as you can. My dad declined to follow that advice. He sat next to his client when he testified before the committee. He advised him to take the Fifth Amendment. As soon as he did, he was branded by McCarthy as a Fifth Amendment communist. He was fired from his job as a bookbinder. He was run out of town. My dad was shunned, literally shunned, by the Montgomery County Bar for a number of years. In 1958, he ran for county council in Montgomery County. And he was elected by a very narrow margin. He was someone who was passionately committed to racial equality at a time when that was not a particularly popular view in Montgomery County. He was one of the prime movers behind Montgomery County's first anti-discrimination ordinance, the Public Accommodations Ordinance. It was not only the first in the county, I believe it was the first in the state. When he stood for re-election in 1962, my sister, who was a very little girl, remembers holding his hand at a campaign event when a rather large person came up to him, poked his finger in my dad's chest, said, I wouldn't vote for you if you were the last guy on earth. I have to paraphrase the next part. He said, you are an African-American loving Jew. He was right about that. My dad, unfortunately, lost that election, as did every other member of the county council who voted for that anti-discrimination ordinance. What it taught me as a kid was the importance of fighting for justice, of standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, and of sticking to your principles. And I have applied those values to my service in the Maryland General Assembly. I'm in the Senate, been in the Senate for the past 20 years. I chair the Judicial Proceedings Committee. I've had the honor to work hand in hand with the NAACP on a series of issues, with Elbridge James, with Gerald Stansberry, and with Ben Jealous. And we've fought and achieved important landmarks. In the last year alone, we repealed the death penalty. We passed the Firearm Safety Act. I was the point person that spent 4 days leading the fight for that on the Senate floor. It's a bill that will keep guns out of the hands of people who don't deserve them, and it will save thousands of lives in our state. I've been the sponsor of laws to protect consumers in our state from cheats and frauds and scams and help them save their homes from the threat of foreclosure. And I have also stopped bad legislation. Mandatory minimum sentences come across my desk every single session. And that's where they end. I put them in my desk drawer. They don't come up for a vote. Stand your ground legislation came up in our committee years before the Trayvon Martin case. Years before that. It died in my drawer. I wouldn't bring it up for a vote. If I had brought it up for a vote, it would have passed my committee and passed the Senate of Maryland. I hope it wouldn't have passed the House, but I can't give you any guarantees. Those are things that I have done as a chairman of the Judicial Proceedings Committee. And here's Delegate Braithwaite. I'm fighting some important battles this year. One of which is the result of a Court of Appeals decision in DeWolf versus Richmond. It requires us to provide more public defenders earlier in a criminal case. That's a good thing. It's very expensive. And there are smarter ways of dealing with this than just giving people a lawyer at an earlier point in time. I've got a bill to create a pretrial services program. We can implement that. We can divert 50% of the people who are charged with crimes, keep them out of jail in the first place. We know that even spending one night in jail means that someone is statistically more likely to offend later in life.